Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a good lunch, and hopefully this presentation will wake you up a little bit. So I'm Anna Brândușescu. I work for the World Wide Web Foundation on research and policy, and today I will be presenting on the Open Data Barometer and our work on the state of open data in India. So why open data? Well, we believe it should be data that's for everyone, that's a right for all. It's the data that people need, and it should be the data that people can easily use. But of course, the reality of that is not so merry. And so before I go into the reality, a little bit about the Open Data Barometer. So the Open Data Barometer is a global assessment of open government data, and we look at readiness, implementation, and impact. And what we mean by that is we look at readiness, which is policies, strategies, initiatives, data protection laws, right to information, support for innovation, civic engagement, and educational components. By implementation, we look at specific key data sets in 15 sectors. And that's basically the most technical component of looking at the open data, as it is defined by it being machine readable, up to date, so timely, with an open license, if it's available, is it in a digital form, and all those aspects of it. And by impact, which of course it's always hard to measure and to assess, we look to see in the sort of 10-year evolution of open data, how has open government data specifically progressed. So we assess this across 115 countries, and what I will be showing you is results from the 4th edition. We're working on an interim edition that's covering a shorter amount of countries, so 30, but I'll go into that later on. So as I said, it's really important to have open data, to have it for everyone, to have the data people need and the data that people can easily use. However, that's really far from today's realities. So before I go into the state of open data in India, I will just show you a few findings from the global level. So in our 4th edition of this assessment, we still realize that most government data is still not open. So only 7% of data is truly open, and only 1 in 2 data sets are actually machine readable. And it's really not the data that people need to improve their lives. So as you can see, budget data is only open 10%, company registry data even less, and that goes for government spending, contracting, and land ownership, which is 1% globally. And last but not least, most government data is hard to use. So you don't have, less than 1/3 of the published data sets include basic metadata or guidance documentation. So because open data is still arguably a technical field, you need their information and the metadata to be able to explain what you're looking at for people who are outside of researchers and a very specific group and niche of people studying this, usually governments and civil society organizations that are involved. So given all of that, we still have a long way to go. So now on to India, taking a closer look at the idea of open and open government data at a national level primarily, which is one of the limitations of our methodology, I would say, and of other global open data assessments, because we don't focus in on the subnational level, and a lot of the things that are linked to impact and collaboration and engagement actually happen there, although there are some cases that we do analysis for some of the questions we do ask. So this got messed up because of interoperability or lack thereof. So India right now is ranked 33 out of 115. It has a score of 43. Readiness is 68, so that's pretty good. That's looking at policies in place, strategies, civic engagement levels, support for innovation and businesses and startups, and also training available in the country. For implementation, it's at 32, so you can see that there's still a long way to go in terms of having all those data sets truly open. And ironically, the impact is higher, it's 35, so we could see that a lot of the case studies that were drawn from engagement at a subnational level, at a city level, has actually brought that impact higher in terms of the innovation components of impact and efficiency. So here I'm showing you the evolution over time. So how is progress being made or not across the different components that we measure for readiness? So for open government data, we know that the initiative has been strong. India has been one of the champions in instilling an open government data, a national open government data portal from 2012. It was one of the primary countries that signed up to the Open Government Partnership, and it was very much an early champion, but not much has progressed since. As we can see in terms of policy and strategy, there has been progress in putting ones in place at a national level, and data protection has been arguably gone down, and we could possibly talk about Aadhaar and what that means in terms of how the government is investing in an interoperable data infrastructure system aside from e-government or open government and open data specifically. As we can see, right to information is about the same, but not as scoring as higher as in previous years. And civil society engagement has been strong. Support for innovation has been lacking, but city activity is really the one thing that shines, along with training that's been constant. So in implementation, it's been interesting to see how not much has changed in terms of the availability. Maps is the one that, it's still at 30%, and I heard earlier that the government likes to have a scale that's 1 to 5,000 and reduce granularity. Our key data set looks at the criteria of having 1 to 250,000 scale of openness to actually achieve to score as open data and maps. So we set a high record, and it's interesting to learn and coming here and learn from the different dynamics and politics that are happening in the country. In land, it's not open, and this is not a surprise because it's never open, so it's an interesting conversation to have why land ownership is so contestable, and also it's a data set that a lot of governments still refuse to open today. Statistics has largely stayed the same, and the same with budget. Spending, again, no surprise, as it is very rare to have any country have spending data open at a granular level that you can actually link their budget to spending and see how that money has actually been spent, which would be a real impact in a country to actually be able to have that data available and the analysis made. Same with legislation. Arguably, some would say that it's important to have legislation open in RDF formats and so on, but a lot of people have pushed back on the machine readability of having a lot of legislation data open beyond like HTML. Transport data, again, it isn't open, and that is often the case when a private company owns a lot of that data. So it's usually really good data, but because it's owned by a third party, it's not state-owned. It's not open, and that's not only the case of India, it also happens in the Netherlands and other countries around the world. And that's too bad, because a lot of that data could be captured and analyzed in a way that could be less sensitive than spending or land. So that's another question about data ownership and it moving on from the public government, state-owned data sets to private sector. If we look at companies, again, some of that data is open, but not a lot. And then with trade, that's also questionable in terms of it keeping it open enough because the national statistical offices have access to it, but it's not fully open. And going through health, education, crime, environment data, that's still arguably more open than when we look at elections data or contracting data, so public procurement projects that are, again, 5% open. So this is showing you a closer picture about what do those data sets mean. So what do we look at? We look at if the data actually exists, if it's available online from any government in any form, whether open or closed in terms of it being digital. Is the data set provided in machine-readable or reusable formats? And can you actually take that data and download it as bulk in a CSV file, for example? Is it free of charge? Is it openly licensed? Is the data set up to date? And is it being regularly updated? And if it's easier to find information. And the last one is like the magic question about linked open data, which is really hard to find that for any government, really. So as you can see, there's no open license on any of these. So that's one indicative showing that maybe if the policies would be framed around having open licenses for these data sets, that would be one step forward. So in terms of evolution and impact, really the main components that have evolved are just efficiency and entrepreneurship. So there's a big push in terms of, this is probably related to smart cities and getting startups and projects to run in from the economy perspective and the government efficiency, so linking it to e-government and what it means to make this data available and usable, and then bring in a bit of the transparency aspect of what open government entails. So the strength is really seeing that there is consistent CSO engagement throughout with government officials putting on hackathons and workshops and getting engagement and participation happening at a city level. And again, this can also be seen through the efficiency and entrepreneurship impact scores that I've just showed you. In terms of open data activities in the cities, we could see that there are adoptions happening at the state levels, and then some actually take on that national open data policy and turn it into state-specific open data policy, so that's a nice way to customize a policy towards what it means for your specific state and not necessarily have to adopt the national level mandate. And there have been a lot of appointments of chief data officers and workshops conducted with the open government team. But like I've said, there's not any truly open data for the 15 key data sets that have been assessed. No open licenses. The data sets are not available in bulk. And the data sets for statistics, health, and education and crime were only like partially disaggregated. So it's important to then be able to have a few of these components to make sure that the key data sets are available and are of quality, not just exist. And a lot of the global findings actually resonate with the national ones. So seeing that 9 out of 10 government data sets are still not open, you have data that's incomplete of low quality, you see that the political will does really make or break having open data as a movement in your country. And it's really showing that there is a lack of trust and we need to restore it, but how? And again, a lot of open data initiatives do not promote inclusion and equity. So they focus on the economy, on entrepreneurship. So how do we incorporate these factors in? And some of our policy recommendations that are contestable, one is open by default. So the language around policy in that is really questionable for some countries. India took on the open data policies, but not the open by default language. And that goes same for a lot of African countries and Southeast Asian countries where it's asking like open by default, do you mean open everything? Like what does that mean? So it's very much a top-down, north to south dynamic and rhetoric that's being played. Decentralization of data across agencies. So we've seen that a lot of times that the best quality data is in the national statistical offices. So how then do we get a little open data component in every ministry, the health and education? So it's not all just, it's centralized in one open data portal that's not being updated, but it's available across different ones as well. Another aspect is the Open Data Charter. So this is an international movement, and I'll be talking to you in a second. And fourth, of course, consulting the citizens. So they've started to do this. You have intermediaries coming in and officials from the government do these hackathons and workshops. So in terms of investing to improve the lives of marginalized groups, that's key, but it's really rare to see. So I could share these slides with you later so you could see it. So these are the principles that I've touched upon of the charter. I will just go through this quickly. It's mostly for governments, but basically it's just trying to learn from each other, so peer-to-peer learning on a government level. And what we've done at the Web Foundation with Open Knowledge, Open Data Watch, OECD, and others is bring together these global assessments and trying to understand, like, how do we duplicate efforts or fill in gaps or come to an agreement that certain things can never be measured and work along those lines. So we developed this measurement guide to go through into all these aspects from technical to political of the Open Data Charter and its principles and unpack all of the commitments one by one. So again, I can talk to you later about that for lack of time. But so the one thing I wanted to leave with is access to information. So we can talk about open data, we can talk about AI and how we can link those together and get amazing government quality, and Estonia get the government on blockchain, whatever. But the point is that we have to go back to looking at access to information, because that's what open data and open knowledge should be about. So if we look at it as a fundamental human right, that's really the building block for it and the basis for state-citizens interactions. It's really about it being key for governments and participation, and really the movement of open government data comes from democracy, so we should reinforce that as that's a part of the rhetoric involved in discussing it and in the movement itself. So all of those aspects are key, and again, connectivity to availability of data and access to it and access to information all have to be linked, and we can't work in silos. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. What I really like about these events actually is the different sort of scales we get to sort of experience, and we had some, quite large scale, either big data or large scale sort of theoretical pieces before lunch, and another large scale piece before this. But I'm going to jump right back down to the ethnographic scale and bring things sort of to an everyday context and think about the ways in which datafication in India is affecting a very particular place, and more in the sort of style that Sanjay did earlier with this specific gully. Just to sort of set things up a little bit, this work is work I've been engaged in for the last couple of years, specifically on cards, documents, paperwork, and the materiality of these items, things like ration cards, ID cards, and so on. But it's also based in older work, or in ongoing work, over the last sort of 8 years or so in the city of Sarampur, which is in northwestern Uttar Pradesh. Those of you not familiar with it. And I mean, just to sort of give a little bit of a sense of things, because I think it plugs into some of the things we've been discussing today, this is a city that's spatially quite sort of divided in a variety of ways. So the north of the city here is primarily where I work, and these are where the Muslim mohallas, the Muslim neighborhoods, are located. The centre of the city is much more contested, actually, spatially, and there's a variety of sort of different things that go on there, but this railway line is extremely significant. The moment you cross that railway line, the masjids disappear, the minarets disappear, and it's very much a Hindu neighbourhood, or Hindu neighbourhoods primarily, but also much more affluent as a whole. Now, that's not to say there are not ambiguities and blurrings there, of course there are, but just to sort of put this place, this space in context a little bit, and this, of course, plugs into notions of marginalisation of Indian Muslims, which we're very well aware, is an economic and social reality as well. So as I say, this comes from sort of ongoing work which has looked at artisanship, craft work, labour, and migration amongst Muslim woodworkers in the north of India. But the bit of sort of work I'm drawing on more recently has been collaborative and I've worked with Hirde Nev and Grace Carswell at the University of Sussex. Firstly, sort of focusing on cards and documents, but more recently, as I say, looking at sort of the ways in which digitization is transforming those processes. But in the context of that sort of spatial framing of the city, that sort of spatial construction of the city, there are a lot of very interesting things that go on. So all the government and state offices, for example, are located across that railway line, right? So if you're a Muslim, you have to cross the tracks to go into these sort of slightly alien, imagined borders we were talking about earlier, these slightly alien neighborhoods almost, where you're marked out in certain ways. And also we find a lot of that sort of work, actually, of going to queue in government offices, of waiting, particularly amongst poor people, and this was comparative in Sarampur and also in Tamil Nadu, where my colleagues were working, was highly gendered. It was often women who actually engaged in that work, primarily because women's time was seen as holding less value. And you set that alongside notions of purdah and veiling and so on, and you can see the sort of contestations that are playing out here. But what I want to look at today is a slightly different group of individuals within the mohallas, specifically low-level politicians, netas. So these are men entirely in this context, Muslims who occupy local political positions, elected local political positions. And being an anthropologist, I like to start with a story, a vignette to sort of set things up. So I'm going to introduce Usman. Usman is someone I've known for the best part of 7 or 8 years, and is a local nata, a local politician in one of the neighborhoods. And we're sitting in his house, and he tells me, people always call me or come to my house for the making of cards and documents. Suppose I'm sitting here, and someone comes and says that they want to make a ration card. Well, then I should help them. I am the nata of this place. For applying for cards, they can ask me to use sifarish, and I'm going to come back to the meaning of this shortly, or they can use money. If they do not have money, then they must ask me to lean on that official. And this is very much where this notion of sifarish comes from. It's to lean on someone to get something done. I mean, that's a very simplistic rendering of it, but to lean on someone to get something done. Normatively, might be constructed as corruption, of course, but I'll problematize that later. As I am the nata, I can make the official take some notice of the application. Often, people complain that I am making promises, but then not helping them. As you can see, that person, and he indicates here an old man sat in the corner of the room, is waiting to speak to me. And he's saying, Yaar, tumne mera kaam nahi karaya. You've not done my work. But how can I make the card for him when the website is closed? Before, there was no computer. And so we could do these things with our sources. But now it is very difficult. They blame me and say that I'm not doing their work. They think that sifarish is needed, but cannot see that the computer does not listen to any pressure. Now everything depends on the computer system and not on sources. When the site will open, so the feed-in, and he literally uses this term feed-in, of the computer will start, and we will be able to fill the form. So Usman's narrative really kind of sets up the different areas that I want to cover in this presentation, which is to think about the ways in which the move to sort of online digital ways of issuing documents such as ID cards, Aadhaar cards, ration cards, etc., is interplaying with the local politics of the mohalla and the sort of socially embedded contexts of the everyday. The power embodied within a card or document through its association with the state and the potential it offered to access degrees of provision made it a key artifact in electioneering processes and vote seeking. As such, the offer of helping to obtain a ration card, a pension card, a widow's card, or some form of identity card was a direct means through which allegiance could be sought and votes harvested. However, complaints about broken promises made by natas keen to win votes were commonplace, and often people would complain that these natas make promises in the run-up to the election, but then don't fulfill and turn their back on them when they actually come knocking to ask for something to be done. However, natas and others also emphasised their contradicted position and the variety of pressures they found themselves embroiled in. Stuart Corbridge, by the way, and others have done some very interesting work on this recently. While seen as holders of access to the state, the reality of this access was often limited by their low-level political position and their membership of a marginalised community. Indeed, the vernacular understanding of sifarish is not limited to a one-way process, bound up in the notion of obtaining a recommendation or enabling degrees of nepotism. Everyday enactments of Safarish in Sarampore's Muslim Mohallas also involve complex forms of obligation and pressure directed at both the enabler, or mediator, in this case the nator, and the decision maker. As with Usman, Sajid was also a local nator elected under the banner of the Samajwadi Party. For Sajid, it was this sense of obligation, the notion that one is not only the leaner, but also the lent on, that features prominently in his narrative. And I quote, "My work has its limitations," he says. "Mostly, I do not want to do this work, as it takes a lot of time. However, some people are my relatives, or my neighbors, or they are some type of person that I can't refuse this work for. For some people, you cannot say no, as you have some link to them, and so you have to do Safarish for them. Also, if they put pressure on you because of their vote, then it can be very hard to refuse." Significantly then, Safarish involves the applying of pressure to obtain a specific outcome. However, being lent on is not limited, as I say, to the decision maker, but also applied to the intermediary whose authority or connections make the enactment of Safarish possible. To maintain their position and secure votes, these actors must be able to show that they can lean on others, but must also, performatively at least, open themselves up to being lent on by those within their neighborhood, baradri, sort of the Muslim term for caste, or family. Usman, the nator whose story opened this presentation, Usman's use of Safarish could be articulated merely as corruption. But for him, this was justified, both in terms of assuring his position as a nator and as a means of following through on obligations to his community, a community whom he felt were entitled to utilize Safarish due to the level of poverty and marginalization they experienced. As Usman argues regarding the recent food security bill, this is not a fair system, as both poor and VIP areas have the same quota, so the poor areas lose out overall. If I can help with Safarish to get my family registered, then this is my duty. So, I mean, this obviously plugs into much broader debates around normative kind of constructions of corruption, where corruption is seen, as sort of in very dialectic or dichotomous terms. And anthropologists and others have done a great deal to nuance this, of course. But I wanted to think a little bit more about the state and digitization of the state in this context. Within research on South Asia and beyond, the turn to non-human agency has, amongst other areas, focused on the forms of documentation that make up bureaucratic structures of various nation-states. Much of this work has sought to move away from Weberian renderings of the state, which placed the bureaucrat as a central actor, and instead considers the role of material artifacts, such as buildings, offices, cards, documents, paperwork, and online systems, in producing and being conducive of the state. Matthew Hall illustrates this in the context of urban planning in Islamabad, which he sees as being constituted and negotiated through a regime of paper documents. Here, and I quote, "Order and disorder on every scale are produced through the ceaseless circulation of millions of maps, forms, letters, and reports among bureaucrats, politicians, property owners, imams, businessmen, and builders." Hull points out that, as with other forms of human and non-human mediation, the role played by documents is often invisibilized, a process which is itself a tactic of power. In this presentation, however, I reverse Hull's analogue regarding the apparent invisibility of human and non-human forms of mediation to ask what happens when documents do in fact dematerialize to be replaced with the immateriality of online systems. And I'm conscious here, of course, again, of not setting up a clear dichotomy between the material and the immaterial. Digitization projects in India have come to embody notions of good governance, improvements in transparency, to act against corruption, to reduce fraud, to address issues of marginalization and social exclusion, and very importantly, have been articulated as providing a direct connection between people and the state. However, ADAR applications and other digitized services are now primarily carried out by small-scale, local, private sector agents who, in the context of low literacy and IT skills, mediate, for a charge, of course, between citizens and the state's online apparatus. Saharanpur, as with many other Indian cities, has seen a boom in these outlets in recent years, with a large semi-formal industry developing around the administering of online processes and state welfare or ID provision. In a nearby Mohalla, Nasir worked for Smart ID. He had been recruited through a broker who in turn received a commission for each agent they contracted. So in many ways, this is like a kind of an Avon call-in type structure. The involvement of various private sector companies has led to the emergence of a complex and increasingly crowded card and document issuing market in which companies compete not only with each other, but also with local natives keen to retain their position within newly emerging digitized processes. Nasir, for example, describes how in 2011 there had been only one company, Smart ID, but their operations were suspended after a State Bank of India-sponsored Aadhaar camp was hijacked by local natives intent on claiming the initiative for themselves in order to legitimize their authority and capacity for safarish in the eyes of others. So these guys came and basically took over the site and were jostling with each other to lay claim and legitimize their position as the organizer of this event. When the program of subcontracted Aadhaar agents restarted in 2013, Smart ID were joined by a variety of competitors, including Ramsey and Z-Smart, amongst others. Inevitably, this has created increased competition and impacted on subcontracted agents themselves. The digitization of Aadhaar and other PDS schemes, then, has not removed forms of mediation from the process, but has often involved the formalization and marketization of mediation pathways and actors, with many of these new players operating, by new players I mean the workers themselves, sort of subcontracted workers themselves, operating in precarious conditions, best described, to cite Nandini Gupta, as organized informality. This is far from the disembedding implicit in many representations of digitization in PDS and ID provision. Instead, embeddedness is relocated within marketized arenas of social relations and spaces of social capital, enabling new forms of wealth extraction from the welfare system to take place. Of course, the marketization of welfare provision is not limited to India, but commonplace in various contexts. The opening up of new spaces of commodification within India's PDS and ID provision systems should then be placed within a broader context of welfare marketization under neoliberalism. Sorry, Sanjay. This is not to reify safarish as an ideal alternative, but rather to understand localized consequences of digitization within a broader socio-economic, technological, and ideological context. However, by foregrounding the narratives of low-level natives, I illustrate the complex consequences of forms of material change within the nation-state for relations of power at the everyday level. Counter to many idealizations, digitization of PDS and ID provision leads not to the elimination of mediation or the automatic rationalization of interactions between the state and citizens. Rather, it creates reconfigurations in which new forms of mediation and power relations emerge. Significantly, for India's marginal and minority communities, this may result in a draining away of power from political actors, from political actors emerging from within the community to new players who operate in a precarious market economy, which negates, to a degree at least, an identity-based politics of representation. Much here is yet to be understood, and the contestations engaged in by local natives and others are still in process. As the digitized state develops, so low-level political actors may find new means through which to legitimate their authority or prove capable of capturing emerging digital pathways within existing avenues of patronage, clientelism, and safarish. What can be concretely concluded, however, is the importance of considering the role of material and immaterial factors in configuring political and social relations at the everyday level. Again, as many others have tried to be, I'm not attempting to be materially deterministic here. As the materiality of the paper state gives way to the immateriality of online systems, so our attention as ethnographers should turn to both intended and unintended consequences of material transformations at the level of everyday politics and sociality. Thank you.
All right, so we'll be shifting to South Africa now, so this It's part of a larger project on data-driven urbanism in Johannesburg and Cape Town. But I'll be focusing just on sort of the data activism aspect of this project. So it's a larger project doing sort of interviews and participant observation and that sort of thing with a range of different actors. And so I'll be focusing on just, for the most part, just on some empirical findings from some interviews with some NGOs and community-based organizations that are doing kind of broadly what we can describe as data-driven activism. This is basically the idea that if you use evidence and data and scientific approaches, you may be able to kind of better engage with governments around issues of what they call kind of service delivery in South Africa, which is highly variable and highly uneven. So just kind of briefly on spatial injustice in South Africa, and we've talked about spatial injustice. We talk about this quite a bit as academics, but it's actually something that's within sort of the public vocabulary in South Africa. You see it all the time in the media. There's a Twitter capture there where people are talking about spatial injustice because it's really kind of embedded in the longer history of South Africa through apartheid. Apartheid was fundamentally enabled by sort of splitting up the country geographically in terms of race. And so the map here on the left is sort of the formal zones, racial zoning during apartheid, but on the right here is looking at the data from the census, which shows more or less the apartheid spatial boundaries are in many ways still there. And so there's a huge division, of course, in South Africa. It's no longer formally racial, but it's sort of socioeconomic at this point. But there's also huge issues with data injustice, which kind of links back to spatial injustice as well. There's huge unevenness in terms of data, whether it's mapping data or other types of data in South Africa. There's divisions geographically, like some areas of the country have, some areas of cities have a huge amount of data and other parts don't have much data at all. So it's also the same in terms of some types of, say, social problems. There might be quite a bit of information on, say, health, for example, but less on education or housing or something like that. So this is just an illustration of data injustice. I've done some work in Kaya Sands informal settlement on the margins of Johannesburg. And so this is Google Maps showing what's there for Kaya Sands right in the middle. Look at the satellite image there, and you can see that there's an informal settlement there with about estimated sort of around 20,000 people living there. There's no information on Google. The city has very little information about this place, but it ends up actually being quite a significant community. And so I won't get into it too much here, but as part of an ongoing collaboration with the geography department at Wits University in Johannesburg, we were in there doing some data collection and mapping. And this kind of takes place in a lot of different informal settlements across South Africa and other countries as well, where there's this idea you need to kind of have data and information about these places to demonstrate that they're visible and therefore exist and should be able to access services. So just kind of briefly on sort of the state of activism and what they call people power in South Africa. The idea of governance from below. There's a long history of this right back into apartheid, where if we want to resist apartheid, we need to kind of do it at the grassroots level. And so the Freedom Charter from 1955, the first line in that is "the people shall govern." And this ends up being a motto that is very important in the democratic age as well in South Africa. So this all kind of defines contemporary South Africa as well. People power, active citizenship, protest as well. So it's kind of like, it's a remnant of anti-apartheid activism, but also a pushback against the democratic government who has kind of failed in many ways to provide sort of redistribution of services and equality. One example of this in the democratic era, very successful campaign, the Treatment Action Campaign, which was protesting against AIDS denialism, which was a big problem in South Africa in the sort of 2000s kind of time. President Mbeki was an AIDS denialist, as was his health minister as well. And so the TAC, the Treatment Action Campaign, took a very evidence, scientific-based approach to their activism. okay, to demonstrate that HIV causes AIDS, and if we provide antiretrovirals, people can sort of live with the disease. And so there's a quote there saying, people who actually at the grassroots level knew much more scientifically about HIV than people in governments. And so this has resonance with some of the activism that's happening today. So moving on to kind of the new forms of social activism that are taking part, are coming quite prominent in South Africa. So the success of TAC's evidence-based approach to activism really in part shaped this new era of data-driven activism in South Africa. It was also shaped by, in some ways, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was set up in the aftermath of apartheid, focused on these really big, gross human rights violations, as Robbins talks about here, and often kind of forgot about or didn't kind of focus on the more day-to-day, everyday injustices of land and housing, education, sanitation, health, and so on. And so because of these gaps, there's the emergence of a range of different types of social activism, including data-driven activism. And one aspect or one type of data-driven activism is community-based data production. So the idea that all these places that have very little information or data about them, the community themselves can collect that data using mobile phones and survey methods and things like that, and then kind of make themselves visible in some ways. It's based on this kind of pragmatic belief that the injustices of unequal access to housing or toilets or whatever it is must be made kind of visible and knowable in a format that decision makers would be familiar with. So a second type of data-driven activism is freedom of information activism, which is also very prominent across South Africa as well. So during the apartheid era, secrecy in many ways enabled lots of the injustices of apartheid. So the lack of transparency was kind of really important to kind of maintain apartheid, but actually a lot of people say that the secrecy kind of still carries on to this day. And so as a result of that, there's been all sorts of activism around trying to make government processes, get information, records available to the public. And so the Promotion of Access to Information Act, PIA, was written into law in 2000. And at the time, it was said to be one of the most progressive pieces of Freedom of Information Act legislation in the world at that time. But the reality is, the law says you can access any records about anything, essentially. But the reality is it's very hard to actually get the government to pay attention to PIA requests. And so as a result of that, all of these organizations are springing up. Some of them have been around for a while, but some new ones as well, trying to help community groups access the data, records, information that they want. So it's a very important part of data-driven activism. So what I'm going to do is talk about kind of both of those combined. The social audits in South Africa have gained quite a bit of attention in the past couple of years. The idea of a social audit is this kind of community-based process for monitoring government service delivery and expenditure. So it's the idea that the government says they're going to spend a certain amount of money on whatever service it happens to be in an informal settlement or a township. Let's access that information through a Freedom of Information request, access that budgeting information, and then go into those communities and collect data in a participatory sort of way to see if there's the number of toilets that they said would be there, and so on and so forth. And so here's a map showing a number of different sort of social audits in the past several years. There's been a number since then as well, and a number of different organizations here who engage in this sort of approach. And interestingly, it's been around sort of since 2013 in South Africa, but has a much longer history in India, and that's where a lot of this, the ideas and the methodology started in. So they access the budget information and then go into these communities and see if it's all there, if the money is being spent as it should be. And what these social audits often highlight is probably corruption. So money saying it's being spent, and it's just clearly that it's not actually being spent there. It may just be kind of mismanagement of funds in some ways as well. But what they're able to do is demonstrate that the democratic governments have not really been living up to their promises of redistribution and equality and so on. So what happens often is it gets resisted by the governments, and municipal governments are often kind of very resistive of this process. So for these organizations, engaging in data-driven activism is seen as vital to giving voice to the everyday injustices that happen there. And so what they think is they can succeed by speaking in the language of governance. So rather than just going out and protesting and burning tires and things like that, which still happens quite a lot, that very kind of active type of protest, there was this sort of idea that if we speak in the language of governance, and there's the sense that data and evidence is that language, then we'll have success in terms of convincing the government to provide more services. So some quotes there from a number of different interviewees, talking about we need to have facts to kind of speak to government on their terms, and if we do that, then there will be success in this. But in reality, I mean, data and evidence in South Africa is not really the language of governance in many ways. A lot of other things influence decision-making at the governmental level. So data-driven governance is limited in a lot of ways in South Africa, as it is actually in a lot of places. Okay, we make decisions based on other types of things often. But in South Africa, there's a history of kind of resistance to digitization and record keeping, archiving. All of this is quite poor in a lot of different government departments. And so the government is actually not really up to speed in sort of data-driven decision-making. And so the idea of these community activist organizations coming and presenting this data on unequal access to service is something that they can quite easily dismiss. They dismiss it because they feel that, they can say, your methods weren't very good, your data's not very good, how you went about it's not very good. And so what happens here is, I also interviewed a number of people who work in data governance as a separate part of this project, and they kind of say that, data is not something that is high on the radar, even within governments themselves. And when it is, it's often just collected as sort of a tick box exercise and never really used for decision-making purposes. So just on the last slide here, I want to argue that social audits and other forms of data-driven activism end up sort of datafying injustice. And we talked about datafication a lot, the rendering into data of various aspects of social life, which perhaps weren't quantified before. And this is often talked about in terms of big data, where movements and behaviors, personal opinions and emotions and things like that are now datafied. But certainly in terms of South Africa, where there wasn't data on formal settlements before, all of a sudden there is. And so this is kind of the datafication of injustice. But in many ways, this is limiting. So I think that relying on data-driven approaches to activism is a risky proposition because it's very easy to contest. So there's been very little success around presenting these to municipal governments, a little bit in Johannesburg, but less so in Cape Town, who's been quite resistant in many ways. So they can just say your methods and your data are incorrect. But the other reason why it's kind of risky is because the complexity of social justice struggle cannot adequately be captured by quantitative data. And many of these organizations are starting to realize this, and then rather than just presenting the data to the city, they try to embed the data that they've collected into a longer advocacy process that also has a legal dimension often as well. And so one of the interviewees said he'd never kind of go head-to-head on data by itself. It has to be embedded into a much longer process, and you have to really understand where the power lies. You don't have a great deal of power as a civil society organization, but you have to find out where that power lies. And so in the case of this organization that was focusing on unequal access to land and housing in Cape Town, the power for them lied in comparing what the current government was doing to the previous apartheid government. So what they're doing here is using kind of rhetoric and discourse to try to gain power, and found that actually much more successful than data on its own. And so I guess the final message here is we need to be careful about thinking data is the solution, whether or not it's governments or business are all getting behind data as something that's the solution to whatever problems. Social organizations, social justice organizations as well also have to realize that it's very easy to contest data, and it really kind of oversimplifies a complex world. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question for actually all three speakers, and it's not the same question, but I'm gonna quickly go through each one. Jonathan, for you, you quoted somewhere you need to be seen by the state for
Yes.
distribution, redistribution, etc.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, one of your interviewees mentioned not just people power activism, it's backed by us knowing what we are talking about. And what I'm trying to now kind of contest here is that there seems to be this notion that, when people are seen, when the data is there, the data speaks for itself. But actually it doesn't. It very clearly the interview is clarifying that, it's also backed by our knowledge.
Yeah.
And that is where the entry of expert knowledge is, the entry of other actors and other determinants on what is done with that knowledge, or with, and what is done with that data especially, and where that leads to. So my question there is a lot of, at least in the global south, and especially in a place like India, I'm sure in South Africa, a lot of what works today works because it's invisible. And this is a very it's a very standard argument. Not everything can be visible. But the point I'm going to try and question is, when one chooses a form of visibility in order to correct certain set of injustices, like the fact that redistribution is not possible unless we are seen, but without the safeguards for other impacts of that seeing, which will obviously come along with that. And I'm just wondering whether in your case, in that data-driven activism, were there sort of backfires of, what was intended and what came out because of the fact that data was there now, even if it wasn't state, recognized data. And for Thomas, I think I'd really like to think about this marketization of mediation, and also push you to think about the BJP IT cell.
Say again, sorry?
The BJP IT cell.
Yeah.
And what new forms of the low-level embedded political actors are now, what new form are they taking when they now, on one hand, they have to provide service delivery, and I mean their informal service delivery, through a different, different terrain of technological terrain. And on the other hand, you have political machinery that is gaining currency through the same technological terrain also. And where do they mix? And UP Saharanpur might be a great case to even think of, whether the BJP IT cell has any relationship to this. And for Anna, actually, you just mentioned Aadhaar, and I really want to push it. The latest, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but the latest response by one of the state government actors regarding the Aadhaar controversy right now is that no Aadhaar data was leaked. It was actually just that the name and the position of the current official who had released his Aadhaar number, and related data was available online regarding his general details about his. I'm not even sure you're aware of the incident, but the incident was essentially that the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India chairman put out his Aadhaar number, stating that you cannot access any Aadhaar data from this. Aadhaar is completely secure. And then somebody deposited money in his account, and many things happened. And the state's response was that it's not the Aadhaar database that was leaked. And I'm just wondering, as a open data proponent and as well as a data knowledgeable person, whether you're aware of anything about India's Aadhaar data security.
So my question is, it's most directly to Tom, but I think I would also, perhaps, if possible, others could address it. One of the most significant, because there are issues of visibility in open data, one of the most significant things, and I think it would also apply to South Africa in terms of obtaining documents and people in informal settlements obtaining documents and ID, is an entire industry of fake documents. Okay? I mean, so you never know at what point because you're always faking documents in order to access genuine documents, and that endless circle where the fake chases the genuine, you don't know at what point someone can get it. I'm just wondering whether, because and the whole idea behind mediatizing and digitizing is that notion that you get rid of all that. But I'm assuming that there's actually another layer. I mean, how do ideas of fakeness? Right now, in many informal settlements, the person who can fake the document best is a really important person because he doesn't get other people into trouble. And he usually a man, builds community and family bonds, right? So he's a very significant person. I'm wondering how you build that into the current argument. Even the guy who does Safarish, sometimes people who may not, I mean, so-called, there may be people who don't qualify for a document of permanent residence. And that guy will make sure somehow, you get a document. And so I'm wondering how ideas of faking documents, which is really indispensable part of certainly in the global south, how that builds into what is that layer that's added on when so-called digitized documents, online documents are accessible? How do people stop faking, or the other ways of faking? What happens to that really important economy which exists and has very strong social consequences in relationships?
My question was for you, Jonathan. I couldn't help but notice on your slide when you were talking about the Kaya Sands informal settlement, so you showed like two different screens on Google Maps.
Yeah.
And I couldn't help but notice that the marker that Google Maps had placed was for like a tour of the informal settlement, which I just, thought was striking. I was just curious if you could expand a little bit more on Google Maps and sort of what role Google Maps might play in like the spatial imaginaries that you're working around.
Okay, there's no immediate other question, and I give all three of you a chance to respond.
Where should we start?
Yeah.
From that one? I can, I guess, address that question initially. What role does Google Maps play in all of this? Quite a significant role, and I think probably that kind of pointer to the tours of Kaya Sands might be quite illustrative of what Google Maps is all about in that context. And the only pointer there is for the one person who has developed this kind of business around taking people into this informal settlement. And so it's very much kind of a business. Google Maps is very much a business in many ways, and so that's their primary objective. But the reality is, of course, it becomes a mapping platform that means so much more, right? And so if there's no data on Google Maps, then that isn't great for the community. They kind of see themselves hidden in many ways, although that'll touch on the next question I'll answer as well. So in many ways, they've taken over the role of kind of state mapping agencies in many ways, Google. And so as a result of that, many governments around the world are kind of stepping back from collecting data, and certainly in South Africa as well. Having said that, even if the South African National Mapping Agency was interested in mapping these places, it's not a standard cartographic approach to collecting data in places like that. And so what happens is either it doesn't exist or some sort of community-based approach goes in and kind of collects the data. So so there's a problem of it being missing from Google Maps, but there's other ways to collect that data, and whether or not the city of Johannesburg would take it upon themselves to find a way to do that, or the National Mapping Agency to do that as well. But
Do you want to address the other question?
oh yeah, okay. So the negative aspects of becoming visible. It's a really good point, I think, in many ways. And so this series of interviews and so on really hit home that most community organizations and the people that they worked with were very interested in becoming visible, but it's not beneficial for everybody in any way, right? And so there's lots of reasons why having your community on the map and enumerated in terms of the people who live there isn't necessarily a good thing for the people who live there. And certainly informal settlements in South Africa are there's lots of South Africans, but there's also lots of migrants who might not be there legally, and so they would probably not be very interested in these sorts of exercises because it has no benefit for them necessarily. They might be able to access a few new services that were implemented into a community, but there's actually probably very little benefit from them. And it also goes back to sort of ID systems as well. South Africa has a new smart ID, smart card system that they're really trying to get everyone to enroll in over the past couple of years, much like India's Aadhaar system. But that has very little benefit for people who are not supposed to be in the country, for example, and it probably has more benefit for the government than it does for the people who might get some benefit around being able to access some services, social and health services perhaps, but there's huge pushback against the smart ID system in South Africa that I've seen, and some of the organizations like Right to Know that I talked about, they've sort of developed this ongoing pushback against the smart ID system, partly because of the longer history in South Africa of apartheid, which was based on geography, but based on they had one of the most sophisticated ID systems in the world long before the West had it, for example, because it allowed them to to go forward with apartheid. So there's lots of reasons why becoming visible is something that's not necessarily very beneficial.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks very much for the questions. I'll start with the one on the BJP, I guess. How much has changed as a result of the BJP coming to power, becoming very prominent, dominant in UP, of course, as well? In terms of these low-level political actors, is difficult to gauge how much of that is a result of the BJP's political project and how much is a result of other transformations. But it's worth noting the alignment between the BJP's vision of nationalism or Hindu nationalism and technology, right? I mean, these two things are, as you rightly point out, very much aligned. And we see, of course, in what's happened in Assam over the last 2 or 3 days, right, where suddenly millions of people have found themselves no longer citizens of the country in which they reside. And there's a lot of that already goes on anyway in these mohallas. So a lot of people were telling me, for example, about names, right? The misspelling of names is an endless problem for Muslims in Saharanpur, and I'm presuming elsewhere as well, because often when they go to the government office to register a birth or whatever it might be, it's a Hindu official who sits on the other side of the table and misspells whatever name is given there, right? And then it's when you go back later, right? And you try to, so I've got a friend of mine, his mother was registered under a man's name, right? And now every time she goes to the office, and she's an old lady, and every time she goes to the office, she feels this terrible shame because she's got to, and they laugh at her every time because, but also it makes it incredibly difficult to, when the Aadhaar card issuing then comes, that name is not recognized because it's not a Hindu name, right? And that's not explicitly Hindus who are experiencing that as well. Low caste groups have seen that a lot as well, various other contexts as well. I think something kind of important here is the kind of materiality and meaning that these sorts of documents take on as well for people in the mohallas, which is very different from the kind of articulations around documentation that I've seen in other areas of India where I've worked. And specifically something like an ID card or an Aadhaar card takes on this real significance in the sense that it's not only a utilitarian device, right, through which you can pass through the infrastructure of India, whether that be booking a hotel, you don't really need to book a train ticket with it, but you do know what I mean, all these sort of different things you might do with an ID card, but it takes on this real importance when you cross that border out of the mohalla in the sense that it's now also something to show what you're not. Very specifically to show that you're not Bangladeshi or Pakistani, right, because you carry a Muslim name. So there's this real kind of importance to that. Now, in terms of the BJP furthering that kind of sense of alienation, I suppose, around documentation, that's something that's felt, but it's felt on so many different levels and in so many different ways. I think it would be very hard to pin it down to a single event. But certainly the potential is there, as we've seen in Assam again, to increase that sense of marginalization through issuing or non-issuing of cards, documents, whatever it might be. And the state is noticeably absent from a lot of these mohallas. But one thing I've always kind of reflected on is that absence of the state is not an absence of the state. The state is deciding to be absent, right? And that's something very sort of important as well. But these things are so contested. So. Yeah, sorry, I'll do the faking one. It's all contested, I think, is the main thing. The faking thing, yeah, Sanjay, thank you. I was conscious of your article on this, I think, 2011, 2012, something like that, where you wrote about fake documents and the way they carry the aura of the state with them. I haven't looked explicitly at fake documents in Saharanpur, so I don't have ethnographic data to present on that per se. But one thing I would say is that a lot of the kind of young guys, and they're usually young guys who are recruited to act as sort of issuers of cards and documents, leased a little machine and work on commission. They said, at the beginning we weren't faking anything, right? But quickly we realized when people came to us without the right documents, we could still process that application. But we started taking money for that process, So has all that gone away? No, I don't think so. I'm not quite sure as to how it may have reconfigured the role of the local faker, though. All
right, so on to data being leaked in Aadhaar. So the dichotomy between privacy and open data is interesting because they're not necessarily, if you have open data, it doesn't mean that your private life and your personal identifiable data is being disclosed, because it's about having open government data. Because we, as taxpayers, you pay money, you should be able to have access to that data. So it should not be data that's sensitive or it's personally identifiable. The problem is with the larger idea and technical infrastructure of a database is that a lot of what Aadhaar means around interoperability, linked data, centralized databases, that's really what kind of open data is also looking at, and having these government systems with the data being open in the same way. So confusing the two can be problematic in the future, and the idea of open and what you mean by open, that also hasn't been unpacked. So again, on the potential of national IDs being surveillance systems, and linking that to cybersecurity, because that's always been the number one drawback from governments that I've heard in a lot of countries that say, like, we don't want to go from e-procurement to open procurement because we're afraid of cybersecurity attacks. And that goes into the faking documents part. So I think the discourse there was that faking documents is easier to do it on paper than digitized. So a lot of in terms of the public procurement world, they would rather keep it on paper format because corruption can still entail. So the fact that, again, governments don't open up the key data sets that citizens actually want is the biggest barrier. Journalists won't go to open government data portals to get their information. They'll go to a freedom of information request every time. So how do we then change that to make sure that governments put out data that's not just benefits them or makes them look good to the population? So yeah, we haven't discussed the conversation between privacy and open data enough, but that's starting to become a bigger factor as AI is getting involved in the scene, as we've seen, like, a lot of civil society organizations don't do open data anymore. We're moving along to other things like algorithms and blockchains. So
we've got time for a couple more questions.
I think first question is to Anna. So I registered the point regarding the distinction between privacy and privately, sort of personally identifiable data and open data put out. But I think I'll still kind of, I was also telling you this before, I think, like the kind of thing Sahil was pointing out. So what's been happening in India, what seems the most obvious thing about open data is that it's two sorts of ways it's being used. One is that you actually have these the government putting out open data sets, and there are various sorts of organizations which are taking this data and putting it behind a paywall and becoming this sort of data broker sort of thing. So I think one question which comes out of that, especially for data activism, is whether, so you make data open, but then, does that already presume a kind of literacy, data literacy is something which helps kind of, make use of that data? Is that something which, something like the sort of the Web Foundation thinks about? Just in the context of India. To Jonathan, I'm just this is just a curiosity. There are I'm just curious because you brought up Aadhaar and kind of a very lively scene of Aadhaar enrollment. And of course, it will be quite something if actually a lot of fake documents are being used to get Aadhaar. So, but my curiosity is regarding two things. One is that I think, if I'm not mistaken, currently all private organizations, since the Aadhaar it's connected to what I was telling Anna, with all these, with activists in India finding out that Aadhaar personally identified information which can be gotten through an Aadhaar number is actually listed on a lot of, that's of course a mistake. That's the classic sort of government being quite lax about it. It's not open data. But yeah, it's accidentally open data. If I'm not mistaken, after that, private organizations are not, it's not done through a third party, right? Like Aadhaar enrollment currently, it's mostly, still is? Okay. Okay, the second curiosity is, so I understand this is something, since you're also kind of meeting a lot of people who are using sort of Aadhaar or have gotten enrolled, and clearly it is more than just, it's a pretty serious ID kind of document, and others have spoken about how it's actually, apart from everything bad about it, it's like this, it's like one document which creates a kind of, kind of identificatory, some sort of parity across, because earlier some classes had the passport, which is like this superior identificatory document, whereas, but do you know of people who are using Aadhaar for other kind of actual applications, government applications, like DigiLocker or payments? If they're using Aadhaar to get, obviously phone numbers, I'm guessing, would be one thing. If they're using Aadhaar a lot, like the Aadhaar number, not only as an identifier, it's a curiosity. I know it's not not related entirely to the presentation, but are they using it, for example, for payments, etc.?
Thank you. Three great presentations. I just had one query to John, and this is reflecting back on the whole day, probably. I'm thinking about, your presentation about the difference between Google Maps and the actual informality, and it really resonates with what happens with India as well. And so I'm thinking back to Sanjay's presentation in the morning around the contestation between the GIS, the satellite mapping, and the actual, everyday paper maps. And whether those contestations exist in South Africa, because it seems if I understand what you're saying, is that there's a lot of data activism in the context of trying to be visible. And in the context of trying to be visible, I'm guessing there is also measuring in order to be visible and mapping. So could you speak to that process a little bit, and if there are any challenges or tensions there between that ground level process and the top-down process of who they are, whether it's Google, whether it's the state mapping?
Yes, so there is some movement afoot to try to map and measure informal settlements, to try to estimate population, for example, using satellite approaches. That's certainly something that's happening as well, and it's very top-down, and there's not much sort of evidence of what's actually coming out of that. But there is some movements afoot, especially in Cape Town, which sends planes over to get very high resolution data every year, and then they can map that in an animation to see the city growing and swelling and the informal settlements getting bigger and so on. That data is not really shared, and they don't really speak about it very much. And so there are organizations on the ground where collecting more interesting types of information. I mean, you can only get so much from satellites. You can get the data for like the road or street network, and maybe the kind of size and shape of buildings, maybe estimates of population based on that, but you don't really kind of know what's happening on the ground. And so, so that's why, I mean, in the informal settlement that I worked in, people are like, oh, we'll just send up a drone and map the community or something like that. But I mean, it's ethically problematic in some ways, but it's also not giving you that very interesting information about what's happening on the ground. You need to go and speak to people and engage with them. And so I think, yeah, so there is kind of a tension there, but I think even practically, the on-the-ground version of mapping and collecting data on informal settlements is actually a better approach, even just kind of in terms of the information that you get as well.
Can I add something quickly? Sorry.
Yeah.
I work for an organisation called DAG, an action group based in Cape Town.
Okay.
That's exactly that.
Yeah.
So it was like really interesting that DAG works in like this mode of consensus against the city of Cape Town. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, like working in this mode of dissensus against the city of Cape Town in order to create this like more thicker data of what life in townships or how townships can be mapped. But DAG is based around development and around housing especially, so it brings in this really interesting dynamic that the issue around housing and right to the city is being led by DAG, and that's kind of this idea of, well, we say that we need to, like, for instance, this community needs this housing done now, and here's an empirical evidence base in order to do it, which is, in my mind, creates a really interesting relationship with the city, because in some ways the city has recognized that, and through using almost like third-party public-private partnerships, like the Economic Development Partnership in the Western Cape, uses DAG as like a subsidiary to do mapping on their behalf. Right. So it's like not just this case of like dissensus or resistance. It can be that at times, but this mapping can also be really collaborative in really unexpected ways as well. Yeah. And it's really like, in that, I mean, I'll be presenting on that as a framework to kind of accommodate that, but that really interests me in South Africa, and how that dissensus isn't just like from the ground up, just isn't about resistance. It can also be about collaboration as well, and being strategic about that.
Strategic collaboration is something I think is almost a hallmark of South Africa, whether it's collaboration between the government and communities or by the private sector and government as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for the last couple of questions. Just on Aadhaar use, I mean, when the Aadhaar cards sort of first appeared in, again, I'm only speaking from a local context, from Sarampore, not more generally, but when the Aadhaar cards first appeared in Sarampore, the pretty much the view of anyone you asked was, "Bayi to faltu hai?" You know, no one was interested, and it was seen as a complete waste of time. Where things really started to change, where Aadhaar started to become linked to other things, LPG in particular, right? To get your LPG subsidy, you need an Aadhaar card. So So suddenly the Aadhaar card takes on this real importance and people are rushing to get them. And, once that kind of process gets going, then yes, it's been used for mobile phones, all sorts of things now, and people do carry them, they do use them in a way that they were not, they were not engaging it with that way to begin with. But I mean, that's very much a state intervention as well, of course.
The number itself, like for authentication, I mean, sort of originally planned use. Like, for example, for payments, like,
Yeah.
Just curious, are people sort of your people you're doing ethnography with, do you see a lot of them using it for payments other than identification? I mean, like,
Not so much in Sarampur, not so much for payments. Again, I've got to be quite explicit that I'm talking about a very particular context. The place where I work is primarily an artisanal sort of woodworking industry, and it's still very much a cash economy, right? There isn't much of that going on. No, the cashless economy has simply not really arrived there.
So the inclusive banking projects, they're increasingly pushing people to use Aadhaar-based biometrics as opposed to bank-owned biometrics. And the way they're doing is that the UIDAI has decided to incentivize the use of Aadhaar-based payment by basically waiving the fees. Waiving the fees for. So this has actually two effects. One is that more people are now lobbying for kind of the poor people, tell them that if you use this, then, you don't have to pay. So people increasingly use Aadhaar biometrics as opposed to bank-owned biometrics. And the second effect it has is that people are using payments more frequently. So in other words, what they do is they kind of, put in the money at one end of the city, then they go to the market and take it out at the other end because it doesn't cost them anything. So they get used to doing a lot of kind of digital banking activity. That's a study I've been doing in Madhya Pradesh. This is a kind of a slow curve, but it has exponential growth, and so that's going to happen. Yeah.
I mean, just a final point on that. I mean, these things are transforming at an incredible rate, right? Every time I go back, it's changed again in relation to these digital processes. So I haven't been now for a year and a half. It might well be that when I go back in January, people are starting to do this sort of thing a lot more. I don't know. So
you have the final word.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. So just on the 2 points, quickly on the first, on government open data portals that are behind paywalls. That's really definitely not open data anymore. And then also a second barrier is registration. So you see that a lot where you're being asked for your email and your name, and then you're just like, I don't know if I really want to download this data set. This is actually happening on land registry information in the UK as well. So that's, the registration part of it is really problematic. The second part about making the data open, then what? So data literacy trainings. Our lab in Jakarta does this. So our open data lab works with other NGOs. So one example is opening up a women's development budget at a subnational level. So they work with IDEA at Jakarta, and they work with women's groups in 2 villages, Wanalolo and Girisuko, and they make sure that they digitize the budget books, which is like this big, I saw it, and then they make sure that all of this information goes into a portal, but then it's also translated back into offline. So there's really an important aspect to offline to online and offline again, so you actually include all the people who might not have access to data, or the data is too expensive for them to go on their government's budget data portal. Who does that anyway? And so how then can you make that into an analysis? And so they done this really cool, I can share it with you later, a comic sort of budget, and then also a conversation in Bahasa to explain what's happening. So I think that those kind of creative ways to explain open data are really crucial for everyone to understand what they are. And then the second aspect of that, we have an Africa Summit for women and girls in tech that's happening in Accra. And there we have a series of workshops for different stakeholder groups. And this also includes policymakers, but it also includes civil society and women and girls. So then we look at data literacy, we look at open data, and going into online harassment, but also gender-responsive policy, and what does that mean, and how can governments work towards that? But how can civil society know more about what that means to push their governments to do better? So integrating all those factors are important. It's just that not all of the Web Foundation can do all of that together, so it's too bad that we can't, do more. So we partner with others, organizations as much as possible.
Great. So I thank all the speaker, and you get another coffee break.
I'm going to rush through this a bit because I planned for 15 minutes, but it's fine because Jonathan has done a fantastic job of building on much of the context that I wanted to touch on. So what I'm presenting today is not any case study work or any of results because I don't have any. Right at the beginning of my PhD, basically I've only been working on it full-time for 4 or 5 months. Instead, what I'm going to present to you is the broad brushstrokes, a very general idea of a key kind of framing device that I'm using to make sense of everything that I've done so far. There's a bit of a narrative behind it, which I'm going to fly through really quickly to get through. But in a nutshell, what I'm proposing with my work for my PhD is to utilize mixed methods and a relational perspective to better theorize the role of counter-publics, or civil society, in shaping the smart city. So what I'm arguing for is that rather than being this kind of this lateral or delineated movement of how the smart city lands from national governance to local governance down to the ground, I'm going to, through actor network theory, I'm proposing at least that we can look at how the reverse happens. So how grassroots actors actually hold their agentive capacity or hold the ability through their entrenchments and networks to affect local governance and therefore affect smart city governance and affect this networked idea of what the smart city is. So off Jonathan's discussion, 2 key terms that have come to mind that actually describe this is collaborative dissensus and mutual embroilment are 2 really good terms to think about how this African governance space works. Cool, so that's Neuchâtel, and that's the view from our office. And there's a reason why I have this picture, because for the past 6 months, I've been, so I'm not presenting on a database or a data frame, although that is part of my research work. But while trying to work out the method side, which you can watch this space for future for presentations on that, been trying to think about how I make this data framework in relation to literature such as actor network theory, ordinary cities, comparative urbanisms, smart and digital citizenship, and how all of that is framed into Africa. I've been missing that kind of key ontological frame, or kind of like that red academic thread that weaves through everything and just like makes it click. And a couple of weeks ago, while lying in the lake and staring up at that very same moon, kind of all clicked that this missing je ne sais quoi that's going to make it all like work in my mind is space shuttles. So what do I mean by space shuttles? Well, I'm talking about one particular space shuttle, and that's the Space Shuttle Columbia. And particularly how Latour uses it as a metaphor in his work. So as a practitioner, working with various NGOs in South Africa around kind of like social networks and youth mobility, I use Latour quite a bit in order to like visualize how these systems become like networks of embroilment. And this piece of writing, Network, Society, and Spheres, which was a speech that he gave, kind of always sticks into my mind. And he uses it to describe really powerfully why networks are like a fundamental part of our daily life. And he would argue that, first of all, that when we look at that space shuttle, what we're looking at or what we perceive is a complete object. It's an object that exists in of itself, it has delineated boundaries, and it occupies a very particular physical space that we're aware of. And he argues that this is what you can call a perceived fact. However, as we know of the Space Shuttle Columbia, it had like a catastrophic re-entry. And Latour uses this moment to argue that moments of issue or catastrophe are really powerful because something that we once granted or something that we once perceived as a whole object, as being whole in of itself, that if a particular optic applied to it, we can begin to see the invisible forces at play that actually constitute that object. That no longer is it like whole or complete in of itself, that actually it's embroiled in many other actors like outside of it and beyond it. And he uses the discussion to say, for instance, that, well, we can call these constituent parts actors, but what actually is important is not the actors in of themselves as independent actors, as independent kind of agents, but rather it's the relations that form between them. So the Space Shuttle Columbia didn't fail because of any of one of these actors in isolation. it failed because there was a certain relation between two actors that just didn't click, and that cut a thread in a broader network that brought it down. So in this sense, the space shuttle becomes less about this and becomes something more like that. So we can imagine the object of the space shuttle is actually an object existing within a network rather than an object existing within itself. And I'm glossing over a lot. I know I have to try to get through this. And again, this is an artist, Thomas Saraceno, who uses actor network theory and visual arts to try and demonstrate what these networks look like. And when we take these objects as networks as a whole, we can begin to map them out to surfaces, and he's demonstrated that as well. Okay, so that's great, and that's fantastic, and that's a nice piece of ontological theory, but practically, well, what does this mean for South Africa? How can we use this, or how can I use this as a lens in understanding the actually existing South African smart city? And I need to make two disclaimers here that part of the project that I'm on, which is PI'd by Ola Soderstrom at University of Neuchâtel and co-PI'd by Iona, is that we're using a working definition of what the smart city is, and we're considering it as IT-mediated governance. So automatically there's a focus on governance there, and using the term actually existing to talk about South African smart cities that actually exist on the ground in motion at the moment rather than being imagined in like sketches of architects and planners and designers. So in my mind, the first part of the project that we'll be working on and what I'll be starting with as soon as I get back at Neuchâtel is what is this space shuttleness, or what is this fact or this object within itself that that's out there in South Africa around the smart city. And South Africa in the smart city space is really interesting. The smart city is very different in South Africa than it is to India. In South Africa, the smart city exists more as a set of rhetorics that are deployed at a local governance level in order to justify retrofitted projects that address aspects of IT infrastructure. So we're talking here about last mile delivery around internet and internet service provision, all the way through to creating expanding out internet infrastructure to previously disadvantaged communities out in townships in order to address this notion of the digital divide, which is a term that's thrown around quite a lot in South Africa for the past 15 years. And in my mind, and what we'll be doing for the project is building or using web scraping and digital inquiry and looking at a national scale, provincial scale, city scale, looking at how this discourse or this rhetoric of smartness, of the smart city, how it's distributed across South Africa and building a typology around that. And that's really cool and that's interesting. However, what's more interesting to me for my PhD is, okay, so if we've got this idea of what the objective in itself is, what's that moment of catastrophe which can provide an optic to begin to break apart the actors which are like invisible but still intrinsic to what gives shape to that fact. And instead of talking about catastrophe, the term that I'm thinking of is the census. And I'm pulling on the paper from Kaika last year around this idea of how actors on the ground, counter publics, can use this notion of the census to shine a light on developmentalist practices such as the resilient city and now the smart city in order to show what doesn't work as a form of indicators rather than the checkbox urbanism in which this managerial checkbox urbanism which is kind of complicit of the smart city discourse. And how does that apply to South Africa? Well, thankfully, we've got one academic in particular who's involved in the project, Nancy Odendaal, who writes quite a lot about this in particular. So in South Africa, how do grassroots organizations mobilize around the smart city or utilize the smart city as a form of dissensus against governance? And she's written quite a lot looking at the Social Justice Coalition, which you touched on your work, Jonathan, as well as Reclaim the City and looking at the strategies that they deploy. And I would have gone in context here, but it's basically the South African context is what Jonathan had described. And this is interesting as well, and it's really great, but that research exists and it's emerging through Nancy Odendaal's work. However, there's a key kind of aspect missing for me personally. So while we have a growing literature from Nancy Odendaal on the ICT dimensions of how the census unfolds between especially NGOs and nonprofits and governance, for me, there's a lack of deliberate smart city-specific research in South Africa where that ICT-mediated resistance is framed as just one part of broader actor engagement and embroilment. So what do I mean by this? Well, like the next minute, I'm going to move outside of the smart city debate or smart city discourse. I'm going to look at a body of work from a particular author, Sophie Oldfield, and her work around housing and governance in the census in South Africa. And the key argument that Sophie Oldfield makes is that the census does not equal resistance, especially in South Africa. That rather the check and balance and accountability narrative of the census in South Africa, of that there's almost this expected performance of roles that government, and there's a narrative in the media about governments being perceived as constitutional infidels, that governments fundamentally will always fail to provide or to act on their service provision, and it's the role of civil society to respond in turn, that she argues that that's great and those roles are there, but they're defined as much by collaboration and engagement as they are by resistance. Cool. So I'll skip this. So what does this mean for the South African smart city? What does this framing mean, and what is this notion of like looking beyond, of thinking beyond just the census as being resistance, of having this broader idea? And my conclusion point, I promise, is going to be that is that my thinking around this is that we have key questions emerging around this nature of the smart city. Okay, great. But in South Africa, the smart city, these key questions for me are, do South African smart cities exist in and of themselves? Are they perpetuated through these networks or through networks of embroilment of actors? Do we need to have like a wider perspective? In South Africa, is the materialization of the smart city, does it have profound impact on the political life of South African counter-publics? And what does this idea of the smart city enable, disable, afford, or disturb the agentive capacities of South African civil society as they exist at the moment? Is this a radical change? So is the proliferation of technology at civil society level and at a government level and smart city projects, is this going to radically change the nature of South African civil society? Or are there perhaps new configurations of the census-actor relations that are rejigged and reworked by technology, like what Nancy Oudendal argues? So with all of this in mind, what does that surface of the South African smart city network look like? Is it flattened? Is it made more equal through technology? Or is it still highly differentiated as it is at present? So my kind of concluding thoughts is, I've skipped a bit, which would have kind of opened up this debate a bit more, but I'm a bit doubtful that with the introduction of the smart city, that it's radically going to change the nature of civil society life in South Africa. It might augment it in some sense, but we need to have using actor network theory, we need to have a broader lens of what's happened before, what's happening now, what can happen in the future, to have a more longitudinal perspective and draw generalizations from it. Thank you.
So, just by way of a very brief introduction, I'm firstly an artist, visual artist, working in sort of field of, I guess, social practice, urbanism and social movements. And I'm also therefore an academic in the sense that I'm here and working on a research project. So what I'm going to present and run through as briefly as I can now is a live ongoing project in India, and it's a project that confronts the question of waste and disposability through the introduction of a kind of makerspace or innovation lab into the very spaces and cycles of waste production in Dharavi. And it's not a smart city project, but the way it addresses knowledge politics can kind of be framed, or we'll see later what you think about that, as a kind of challenge to the smart city paradigm. So this has come out of a GCRF-funded project called Giving a Voice to Underprivileged Communities in India, Resources of Hope. And when we started this project, having come to sort of insert this makerspace was not something that had been conceived at the point of going into this project. It was all about impact, but it was kind of open-ended at the time. So there are questions, really the point of today is to say, well, why a makerspace and why in this particular context? So just to give us quick locators quickly, city of Mumbai to the north there, that little patch there is an informal settlement called Dharavi, which is one of the sort of oldest surviving informal settlements in both in the city, and it's one of the largest and well-known in Asia, covering a landmass of 1.7 square kilometers with an estimated population of 1 million people, and it's a very central kind of location with excellent connectivity in the city of Mumbai has made it a very, very contested wholesale redevelopment site. On its northwestern rim here, this is the known as the 13th compound, which is the city's main recycling center or hub, which is responsible for recycling 80% of Mumbai's hard waste, where up to 250,000 rag pickers supply 40,000 people working in grassroots recycling micro-enterprises, often working in quite risky and unsanitary conditions. So Dharavi marks this kind of collision where it's located in the city between these kind of different dystopias and utopias as this kind of neoliberal dream of representing Mumbai as a world-class city of technology and financial services is continually confronted with the quotidian reality of informal settlements like this and their own kind of free market logics. And Dharavi has emerged as a kind of global hotspot in a way of symbolic struggle, resisting these kind of massive waves of demolition and expulsion, where different visions and imaginaries of urban futures often kind of collide in unpredictable ways. Dharavi's own kind of brand of homegrown urbanism sticks in stark contrast to these kind of manicured images of high capitalism that you already know. This picture here shows that northern rim that I showed you on the map. In between is this kind of swamps and the Mithi River, which is one of the most polluted in India. And on the other side is the Bandra Kurla complex, which is Mumbai's kind of financial hub. So you have these two kind of face-offs or dark mirrors kind of reflecting each other. So that high-rise future city is being enacted even as the most kind of basic needs, water, sanitation, health, of more than half of the city's population remains barely provisioned for within that urban infrastructure. And you'll just see in the background there, Mumbai is upgrading. So what's also happening here is a new metro line is going in, which we'll come back to in a minute. So this year, Mumbai has introduced a total ban on single-use plastic, along with the state of Maharashtra, partly as a policy response to waste management, but it's brought the informal recycling industries further into the media spotlight. And the important thing is that the requirements of the recycling relies on this process of self-organized work that's undertaken mostly by low-incomes people, low social status, caste, class, and migrants. You see a rag picker there on Mahim Beach. So, yeah, this is where the new metro line is happening, where I showed you, and this is a kind of rethinking. Is a way of just demonstrating the idea of rethinking the city from below in approaching the mechanisms of urban development and the practices of everyday life from very radically different perspectives to the kind of top-down telescopic or helicopter visions of conventional urban research. So advocates of Dharavi's wholesale redevelopment would be perpetuating from that telescopic view the idea of slums, of myths of crime-ridden underworlds, unfit for human habitation, where the legal framework for slum is a sort of label utilized for the justification of expulsion and demolition, whilst on the ground, there is this complex network of relations and critical independencies between the rich and poor, which researchers like Amin and McFarlane have described as kind of metabolic inequalities that use the metabolic rather than the telescopic lens to refer to the way that local actors are involved in the reproduction of labor and changing capitalist value. The operational logic then behind something, as we've been talking about, behind the data-driven smart city paradigm is the idea that everyday users generate the city. And this, in the case of informal settlements in India, is complexified by continual struggles over space, information, and inequalities of access. So that in the informal city then that is occupied largely by marginalized and dispossessed, the creative problem solving and everyday living solutions inherent to the conditions of informality are in fact driven by local actors who are necessarily smart people. They are forced to invent, provide, and sustain forms of self-organization and engagement with a kind of matrix of this borderline formal, informal state of survival. So specific to the worker colonies in the 13th compound is the city's dependency on workers and knowledge and the skills of, we can think of as citizen science, in this case, people who are using indigenous knowledges to separate and work in recycling plastics, preventing the rest of the citizens obviously swallowing in their own piles of waste. So the project works since 2012. We've been working with an organization called Acorn Foundation that works to improve the welfare of rag pickers and the working conditions of waste collectors, recyclers, but focuses predominantly on the children of these families in an attempt to change their future narratives, creating opportunities for learning and earning beyond the kind of waste management businesses. So trying to keep the children out of the cycles of child labour by focusing on them instead of the working conditions of their parents. So there's sort of an idea in this project of a kind of good practice in sustainable development, or we thought of as that way. And the key thread within our work has obviously been to focus on this idea of knowledges from below. So that's uncovering and kind of revealing tacit knowledges, hidden or silenced expertise, and examining the kind of restorative power of cultural and artistic practices that can reveal and illuminate struggles of the poor. So through these kind of ideas and working with communities in the recycling industries sector, we have come to the point of instigating a kind of what we're calling Compound 13 Lab, which is this kind of emergent makerspace in an area of Mumbai, Dharavi, that can be described as one of the largest informal aggregations of remaker and remanufacturing spaces pretty much on the planet. And we've inserted that into the very spaces and cycles of waste management, utilizing those materials from the plastics and the resources and the skills as a sort of starting point for experimental and ecological design around living solutions. So we've kind of just launched this space. It's very informal, but we're sort of implementing this, or the associated learning and making program provides the current technology. So that's introducing digital and media tools, 3D design, digital fabrication technologies to the members of Acorn Foundation, but obviously to disadvantaged, marginalized citizens who, because of their socioeconomic status, would not normally have access to these resources. So it isn't smart in terms of the data, but it's a space in which those technologies perhaps enable these people to sort of see themselves and learn the skills and tools to be, you know, to put themselves in those future narratives rather than just seeing their lot as, you know, working in the recycling industry. So, a minute, yeah. So I'll just wrap up now. So we've began that process by implementing a kind of residency program for artists, scientists, designers, engineers, and we started this off with a project working with sound, because the main sort of tool of expression there has become rap, and that's a kind of that's the sort of perform public expression. So we've been working with those kids to basically record or make kind of hip hop sound production from a co-production film that we've made about the story of waste and the history of plastics. So that's just those recording sounds. So the slide's a bit off there, so I'll just end here by, this is a demolition site within the workers' colony, within the recycling industry, that happened sort of 5 years ago. It was one of the first expulsions where people in Dharavi were denied the right to rehousing within Dharavi itself. And really, through this idea of creative residencies with artists and designers, we want to explore basically the narratives that challenge these notions of disposable products and materials, but also reflect on the reproduction of labour and the biopolitics of disposability, which is to say, the negative perception and marginalisation of informal labour, in particularly the social class of those handling waste materials, And the human sanitations themselves means that their bodies and as people and as labour becomes waste and can be understood as waste, and therefore they are at the lowest role in society as waste pickers and rag pickers are essentially disposable themselves. So we're trying challenging that biopolitics of disposability through this project as well. So I'll end there. That's just the guy's recording. So.
Hi everyone, I'm Ganesh Tarman. I'm at the end of my PhD, at the last stage of my PhD, which I carried on open data practices here in London in the context of Smart London. So after traveling all around the world, we are ending up back here in London. I couldn't attend yesterday, so I really hope I won't be repeating what has been already said. So my working title is Open Data and Smart London Governmentality, thinking through discourse, infrastructure, and citizenship. And for this research, I have observed several organizations in London that I identified as relevant to smart city planning and open data discourse. The reason I wanted to focus on open data was when I was doing my MA in 2013, it was on what smart city meant in London context. And at the time, I had no idea about what open data was, etc. And then I was interviewing all these people who were members of Smart London Board, who eventually published first Smart London report. And I was surprised that they were pretty much all of them, and including the ones who were working for multinational companies, they were really dismissal or critical of the term smart city, and really sarcastic, but they were quite excited about the opportunities of open data and how it would shift power relations radically, etc. Honestly, I wasn't convinced, so I decided to carry out a critical research about it. So in my research, I started with a genealogical study of how data-driven city or how data-driven interactive built environment came out to be. So I started, I went back to post-war era and tried to understand how urban planning, data technologies, and urban subjectivities have developed in entanglement by looking at both cybernetics and neoliberalism. Here I looked at different aspects of how cybernetics was applied to built environments and urban planning in various and indeed in very different ways. And the reason why I want to start with that was that both in critical smart city literature and even with the commercial smart city world, there's such thing called as IBM smart cities, and everybody is very, again, like skeptical about it. They're like dismissal of it. So I just wanted to understand what actually IBM smart city is, or is it a really distinct category? The short answer is no. And then I concentrated back in the UK, and I looked into the discourse in which open data became a tool, or rather apparatus, in mobilizing an entrepreneurial and technocratic city, as opposed to open data movements in which open data was formulated as a democratizing idea, and how it was endorsed by the UK government, particularly within a transparency agenda. And then by focusing on Open Data Institute as discursive and non-discursive, I try to understand if open data-driven smart city in London is actually really something that is something else than entrepreneurial or technocratic. Other things I've looked at is, again, Greater London Authorities initiatives like London Data Store and the APIs within it. And then I discussed citizenship acts and what these tools actually offer in terms of citizenship acts. And then I also followed an activist / politician / radical / lobbyist figure, Rosalind Reedhead. Her title depends on from which angle you want to look at her. And her cast to ban private cars in London. Shortly, this thesis has been one that looks into how data technologies and particularly open data implementations transform and also perpetuate power relations in London. However, Smart London has another side, which I unfortunately didn't have the time or space to expand on much in my thesis, but I'm very intrigued. In addition to implementing these technologies on London, Smart London also means exporting all these technologies, political discourses, and eventually subjectivities to other parts of the world. As I have observed throughout my research, from small-size, socially aware companies to startups, to public-funded institutions, or not-for-profit state-funded organizations like Future Cities Catapult and Open Data Institute, every actor in this ecosystem aims to export their technologies and discourses. In fact, I wouldn't be exaggerating when I say, as often repeated by the new Chief Data Officer at the City Hall here in London, when he says like smart cities, Smart London should be about ensuring that the UK is not Smart London should be about being ahead of the technology curve. It actually means to ensure that the UK is not a recipient but an exporter of these technologies. And of course, the majority of these cases, these countries to be exported are not those in North America or West Europe. Arguably United Arab Emirates, and United Arab Emirates is the most popular one, and then follows Saudi Arabia, and South Asian countries like Malaysia and India are also really popular. On the other hand, through partnerships with World Bank and the UN, African countries get their share too. I actually have the feeling that competition in sub-Saharan African countries is really fierce, as China is a very important player in that geography. So just to give you an example, here I want to show a few initiatives by Future Cities Catapult. So Future Cities Catapult is a publicly funded organization to research at the intersection of urban and technology. And their CEO, and it's one of the organizations that definitely reject the idea of IBM smart cities, and they're all for civic-centered smart cities. So their CEO, Nicola Yates, in her article that is titled "The Rise and Fall of the Smart City Concept," she starts the article with, that's the quotation, "The smart city rose to prominence as a marketing concept from global technology companies that saw an opportunity to sell digital transformation and new technology into big city systems such as water, energy, and transport." So that sentence is very familiar to all of us. Like, this is the exact sentence you find in every critical smart city article. And then she goes on to elaborate how there are lots of regulatory challenges around artificial intelligence and the perils of technologies such as facial recognition and so on. And then she finishes the article in quotation. "The good news is that a smarter public sector will have a double benefit. The first is better managed cities. The second is that in embracing the opportunities new technologies bring for cities, we will also create new market opportunities, aiding and stimulating innovative companies across the UK, and they, in return, can sell their new products and services around the world." And here I can show you, these are just random, very quick examples of how Future Cities Catapult is working all around the world. This is their project with Malaysia, This is their SME breakfast meeting for UK SMEs to showcase to United Arab Emirates officials. Then there is one in Mexico City. And this is their project carried out in Brazil. These are by no means an exhaustive list. And as for exporting smart citizenship, when I was researching Open Data Institute in the mid-2017, they were in a financial conundrum during which they had to limit their activities considerably. Yet around the same time, ODI turned its attention beyond the confines of the UK to train governments in the techniques and strategies of open data. They had already been carrying out numerous activities on an international scale, from Malaysia to Mexico, Ghana to Saudi Arabia. But besides that, ODI is also a contractor for international institutions such as the World Bank to train governments of less wealthy countries on opening up their data. So they work with Tanzanian government. So maybe I can finish with just saying, like, we've been talking about it during data activism panel, but I just want to underline that open government data is not necessarily a precondition for an open government, and the presence of open government data does not automatically yield an open government that thrives on accountability. So what's actually happening here is I think more like what Ayana Datta called that smart citizens in the future Indian city is becoming synonymous with the production of a post-colonial technocratic subjectivity. I think this is clearly exemplified in these activities as well, basically.
Thank you. Thank you very much again. Really, really interesting papers. I had a couple of questions for a couple of the presenters. I'm sorry, I haven't got the thing to hand, so I don't remember names, I'm afraid. The gentleman who was talking about South Africa and your PhD research. I mean, there was just a couple of things. It's more of a comment, really, than a question, sorry, because it just sprung to mind as you were talking about a lot of this and this use of the census to kind of turn that gaze onto the state by activists, citizens, whatever else. And it reminded me a lot of this body of work on right to information in India, which has sort of conceptualized things in that sort of way. Quite a lot of it using kind of Foucault, you know, the notion of turning the, panopticon onto the state, right, and therefore disciplining the state as opposed to the other way around. But people like Martin Webb and Nayana Kamathura have written about that fairly extensively. There's other stuff as well on there, but again, you know, it just sprung in my head as a parallel. I wondered about the piece on, sorry, again, names I should have looked, on Yamu and this sort of website, which I thought was very interesting. And I just wanted to ask you if you've sort of engaged with theories of affect and, you know, if that's been a part of your work, and if so, how?
Any others? Yeah.
For Gunesh, so basically I'm curious about, you made a very useful and probably a usable idea for a lot of us in terms of how the idea of smart London as a handler of technological turf is not just as a recipient but also as an exporter. And given the location both in very real financial terms but also in epistemological and ontological terms, the location of London in the imaginary of post-colonial people, but also in terms of how Commonwealth colonies are always kept alive here in very real terms, in terms of, for example, giving us voting rights in the local communities, etc. So for me, it was very interesting to observe while I did my PhD here in London, and that's how I actually became more aware about what voting rights I have here and what is my sort of negotiation with mayors and councils in my neighborhood at one level. And at the other level, when I went back, I started getting these Twitter notifications from like Oxford City, Manchester City, who were calling for world contribution to making their city better as stakeholders, because the imaginary is of, as educational hubs of the world, and at the same time, like, linkages with London and so on and so forth. So I am curious that if you're taking that line forward in terms of looking at what is the other side of London, I'm curious, how do you look at this strategic evoking of a citizenship which is both real and not real? Like, we are allowed a certain agency in a certain way that I am expecting would give certain advantages to UK, right, and London. And at the same time, giving a pushback to these quote-unquote citizens when, for example, immigration and visas and kind of surveillance that happens here. And given the context that Oxford and Manchester were inviting these inputs from other citizens, at a time when in US, Trump was pushing back the immigrants, right? So this sort of a political scenario and the implications that it has in terms of positioning London in some new ways.
Any others? Yeah,
just to sort of follow up on that one, I guess. I was the question is, do we need to spend more time thinking about public-private partnerships when we're talking about public governments and private tech companies, and how they're often in it together in some cases, like Cyborg Labs in Toronto, Hudson Yards in New York, and IBM and various partners, and then how these public-private partnerships act in these global cities, in both financial and cultural ways, and how then that gets exported out to these other various cities around the world. These sort of relationships, perhaps we need to pay more attention to them.
Just building on that and a quick observation, why are we just considering the public-private partnership as the only regime for data? It's just linking with everything always is, if we are trying to overcome, because these 2 days, let me tell you that I was thinking that the academic world was already accepting that the so-called smart city was overcoming, but my feeling is that it's not yet. So for me, the driver should be how we consider data in another kind of schemes, and of course, going beyond the public-private partnerships, I would say.
Okay, thank you. I'll just make a comment. I don't have to answer. One of the things, at least 3 of you addressed very clearly, something we haven't addressed, and which is a really big area, if you're working in India, China, Brazil, is middle class, the notion of middle classness and aspirations. But 3 of you addressed that in different ways. But anyway, please answer. Go ahead.
Yeah, the first question was had so many things packed in it, and honestly, I don't have an answer to that. But at least in my research, I think about the idea of quantification and automation in a historical context anyway. And of course, UK through colonialism just exported this idea for ages, and there's a by no means I'm an expert in colonialism or post-colonial studies, don't get me wrong. This is a really more of a comment rather than a research finding. But in terms of immigration, in the chapter where I look at a particular app, a transport app called CityMapper, I don't know if you're living in London, I'm sure you know. Its founder is a Pakistan-born guy who was educated in America, so he's not a British citizen. And he's loved by all the smart city community in London, regardless of his immigration status, etc. He's the best example of what Smart London produced. And I think it's matches perfectly with London's like this entrepreneurial spirit, good immigrant, bad immigrant story at large. In terms of public-private partnership, honestly, I don't think I understood the last comment, but if your question is like whether this is something being exported as well, it surely is, but I think it's, while public institutions here, or private institutions rather, private institutions, private organizations partner with public organizations, as far as I understand, like in these different geographies, but it hardly ever works in the way that public UK organizations partner with private organizations outside. It's more like, it's always like trying to create a market for companies here, or organizations like Future Cities, Catapult, etc. But yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't understand your comments.
Sort of about how the reasons why tech companies choose certain cities as sort of test beds.
Yeah.
And whether the, like you said, I think the relationship's more complicated than you might think. But if they're successful in certain contexts, are then those sort of ideas transported and exported to other so-called smart cities?
Okay. Well, I think the idea is whatever is produced here goes to other places. I don't have a particular knowledge about whether they travel around, but I can say, for instance, the technologies that are not tested in London are also being exported. And it's not only tech companies, by the way. I have to say architecture companies do the same. It's, I think it's Mastar, again, is built by Foster and Partners. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure they implement it and replicate in other cities as well.
In order to just provide you an extra explanation of what I said, we are starting talking about Mastar. Mastar has been, as an example, has been criticized from all the sides in academic work in the last 5 years. What I would like to say is that just considering public-private partnership as the only scheme is not valid anymore.
Well,
it's the only thing that I'm saying, because other cities, some cities mainly Europe, are experimenting with some of the schemes, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Let me just,
Sure.
maybe you could have a discussion later, but maybe...
Just, I will just say, I wasn't actually talking about Mastar at all, but yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, go ahead. Next.
Yeah, thanks for the question on affect. So that was a really, really new paper. I mean, it's not a paper at all yet. It's a series of thoughts on Yamu. But yeah, I think affect is a really productive lens for looking at some of these things. I mean, I'm not an affect theory kind of expert, and my way out of dealing with affect is always to talk about structures of feeling, because I really like that Raymond Williams gave us this thing that's like so easy and portable to use and doesn't actually demand that I do any reading on affect at all. So I've sometimes used structures of feeling, but I do think that what I was trying to bring out through those excerpts from Yamu was some of that affect. There's a kind of, like sarcastic, cynical voice that certain Yamu reviews use, a sort of like tiredness of some of Colombo's development problems and issues in lagging behind in urban development, but then combined with a lot of this like cheerleading for certain government initiatives and like excitement about government programs, some of which deal with like smart city type things. So yeah, I'd love to chat with you another time about other readings I could have drawn.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, Thomas. That was great. What's really great about the PhD that I'm involved with, the bigger project, is that it has a comparative aspect. So I'm working with Percy's at the back, who's involved in the same project, but on the Indian side. So a big part of our work is that her and I mean, it's still early days now, but for the rest of this year and going into next year and the year to follow, that I'll be flying through to London, she'll be coming to Neuchâtel, I'll be going across to India, she'll be coming to South Africa later on in the PhDs, and we'll be doing this constant exchange back and forth with each other to shape each other's work. So from the South African side, for instance, that might necessitate a certain literature or a certain method to be deployed in order to break apart the complexities there. But what's really great for me is that I get to sit with her and we get to compare notes that for sure there might be these like completely different contexts which necessitate these different approaches, that there might be these striking parallels that we had never considered before. And that, I don't know what that's going to entail yet, but that really excites me. So the fact that you mentioned that literature already, like I've been quite involved for the proposal stage and like heavily reading general literature and the South African stuff. But flagging this is really important because I've got no doubt those parallels are going to start coming out as the year comes, you know. So thank you.
Did you want to add? I wanted to ask you about what happens to the music, the rap music. What's the, the rap music you're working with, the young people? How is it being used? What do they do with it?
So we're just, it was just sort of initial residency that, was beginning with what is most important to the people on the ground in terms of use of cultural tools. And so it's a kind of participatory film that we've made, and they were doing the kind of soundtrack to that film.
In Marathi or whatever the Hindi?
In Hindi, in Marathi, in Tamil, yeah. So.
Do you have a quick comment? Do you have one more? No. Did you have a...
Oh, we've got another session? Okay. I just wanted to you said that the members of the Smart City Board were dismissive of the term smart. And could you just tell us a little more about this? Why, how?
Well, it's a long story actually, but that's the first, yeah, okay. I'll try to keep it short. That was the first Smart London Board, which was formed by Greater London Authority, and it included all these people from academia, IT, startups, as well as few multinational corporations as well. So it was a real mix, like very heterogeneous group of people who were, there was even a journalist, a tech journalist in it. So they all thought, and these people include people from Arab, Intel, etc. They were like, oh, smart city is just, it's such a used marketing word. It's not, we shouldn't endorse that. Like, nobody knows what smart city is. They were all like really dismissal of it, although their name was Smart London Board. But then I'm talking about 2013, by the way. But they really thought there was a radical potential in open data, and that smart city should be based on open data, and that was the only way citizens could be empowered and take back control, etc.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Okay. We've had a really, certainly for me, I haven't really been to a workshop like this before. It's so many different points of view. Hopefully we'll meet up again, but we'd really like to develop, I think the word is platform, is that right, Mario? To work out how we keep in touch. Thank you. Let's have a drink and join us for dinner. All of you. Thank you very much.